Last time we had a recap of the situation in Mythic Plus was at the end of week 2 of the season, at the very beginning of week 3. It was 8 days ago. So now, on this Friday, we're gonna have the recap after another full week has gone by, the third reset of the season. Interestingly, right at the beginning of this week, we can't see, of course, the full results yet, but this was the balance tuning reset. This is where, for example, specs with an eye for Mythic Plus, specs like Fire Mage were nerfed, specs like Balance Druid and Elemental Shaman were buffed, Shadow Priest was nerfed, you had Demolock buffed with Windwalker nerfed, etc, etc, so that might also have some impact on the results in Mythic Plus. But for now, these buffs and nerfs are only a couple of days into this fourth reset. Instead, looking at how things ended last reset to see any more trends we already talked about. And yes, to be fair, unlike last week where we pointed out the possible surprises in the compositions in Mythic Plus, this week is the confirmation week. After last week's possible surprises, this is going to be the confirmation of what we thought was going to happen. So in this week 3, this is the current popularity change of specs in Mythic Plus. You can see that for healers, Discipline Priest remains in its 60-ish% range, not really that change compared to the previous weeks. It practically started that popular from week 1 and stayed that way. Vengeance, on the other hand, has kept growing. Perhaps there were some old-timers still believing Prot Paladin after their domination in Season 1, but week after week, Vengeance now has reached the new high of the season at 74%. Granted, it's a long way to go to reach the high of 96% of Prot Paladins in Season 1, but it might be getting there in a few weeks. Where we have more relevant changes to confirm the trend we had been seeing last week is in the DPS, because, as you can see, we have a 3-7-12, and even current week, I know it's only a couple of days, but 3-7-12-14 when it comes to Unholy. Unholy DK continues to be the growthest of the DPS specs since the beginning of the season. We also have the confirmation of the growth of the other two specs we were talking about becoming part of the trio in Mythic Plus of DPS comps. One is Fire, 10% week 1, 16% week 2, 19% week 3, and also currently the most popular DPS in high keys. And then the third one, Balance Druid, 12% week 1, 14% week 2, 17% week 3. None of the other specs have grown significantly. After all, just mentioning these 3 specs, there is a over 10% gain of these specs in Mythic Plus, which means other specs must have lost some representation in high keys if these 3 specs are growing. To look at this from another perspective, these are the points, the average points in keys in Mythic Plus so far. We can see the gap of these 3 DPS compared to all others. There are quite a few of them, trailing the top 3 specs like Subtlety, Enhancement, Elemental, Arms, even Feral Druid, but there is a clear divide at the very top with these 3 specs at the moment. You can see it in other pictures as well. This is an average of the score of players entering past +7 keys all the way up to +17 to see what average score these specs have in Mythic Plus, and you can see, of course, the highest ones, averaging Fire, Balance, and Unholy in the S tier. Actually, a nice round cut. The only 3 ones above 3k average are these 3 specs, and the ones trailing at the moment closest are Elemental, Feral, and then why not? One after the other, all 3 of the Rogue specs, just to prove how in how bad of a state Rogue is currently, all 3 specs being very high up on average still in Mythic Plus. Looking at this again from other angles, these are only keys from 12 onwards, so quite high keys at the moment. You have Outlaw and Unholy at the very top, even though, of course, Unholy is vastly more played than Outlaw. So these numbers are much more of a niche pick, Outlaw is, compared to Unholy in terms of numbers. And then for the range, you have Balance, Fire, and Elemental. Interesting, of course, as we mentioned, that this very reset, this was nerfed and these 2 were buffed in terms of particularly single target damage, not really their AoE. You can also look at something less relevant in terms of meta, in terms of how specs are doing, which is the DPS. We ended week 2 with this average DPS of specs, and then week 3, this latest reset that just ended ended up like this. We were joking about how curious it was that despite these 4 specs being head-to-head, neck and neck between each other, 2 of these were buffed and 2 of these were nerfed this reset. But it does confirm at the very least that all of these specs do have very high damage. So, you know, we have this incredible pattern that some of the specs currently being amongst the most meta also happen to be some of the specs doing the most damage. Who would have thought? We have already touched on a few of these great performers. We even had a specific video a couple of weeks ago about some of these possibly rising specs above and beyond the more popular at the time. We touched on Sub, on Elemental, on Balance, and on Unholy. Not much actually has changed in how they operate. It's still pretty much the same when it comes to Mythic Plus. Unholy is still completely committed to their RNG damage of their deer at this point, Blood Beast. Now, it's relevant to say, you know, to wonder, is it really about RNG, about RNG if in the end their consistent damage is this high? You know, you wouldn't call this RNG if every time on average with like 11,000 logs in the top 2,000 keys at this level, they still end up having this much damage. It will mean that, you know, very likely this RNG is quite consistent for them to do this much damage. Here is the little pal. The little pal Blood Beast in a single application when it spawns and then blows up with the explosion, doing 1.3 million DPS by itself. And that is remaining pretty much the strength of Unholy in these kind of big pulls. If we actually condense it to make an even cooler number, it's a 20 million DPS burst for Unholy, which is a big part of their power in Mythic Plus. Whenever you have massive pulls and you can benefit from the explosion of your Blood Beast when you play Sun Lane, not really focusing, as we touched on before, on pretty much any talent centering around your pets. You just ignore all of them and you go for straight, flat damage increases, because these damage increases, whether it is a strength increase or more damage taken from you, is all gonna scale with your Sun Lane damage, with your Blood Beast damage, etc, which is a big part of your damage. Now, one question could be about the damage of Balance, which is not overall nearly as high. Even if you were to look at the damage rankings here and you look at the average DPS, you know, Balance it's doing okay, but it's not that it is that OP. It's even losing most of the time on average to Feral. So even if you were to wonder, hold on a second, but if we just bring a druid because of being a druid, we need Typhoon, we need Vortex, we need an Interrupt, we need some, you know, an Incapacitating Roar, a Combat Rest perhaps, Mark of the Wild for some verse buff, right? Well, Feral is there and Feral is out damaging Balance, so why not just bring the Feral Druid instead? Well, it is a couple of reasons. Number one, Balance Druid excels in specifically this build when you play Eluna's Chosen in AoE pools, especially in longer AoE pools where they can sustain multiple dots permanently kept up by your Starfall, which continues to, you know, extend the duration of your dots constantly, so you can practically keep that up forever. And the absolute stream of astral power you will gain by having these many dots on targets will make you spam tons of Starfalls, which will give you tons of usages of your Fury of Elune. That is the, you know, the specialty of Balance Druid, these kind of long AoE pulls. When it comes to single target, they are much weaker, which is why it was surprising, or I guess very, very good for the Balance Druid to see this newest reset to have them buffed, particularly in single target. You know, in a fight, in a pure single target fight, Balance Druid is not that good. They don't really have that many tools to do that much single target damage, which is their weakness in Mythic Plus, and perhaps what might condemn them overall to have lower damage than the other specs, than a bunch of other currently meta specs. But their unique feat, their unique niche is very good in Mythic Plus. And if you were wondering still about the divide between Feral and Balance, well, we still touched on what is going to happen when Vengeance is meta and you run the caster comp, right? Vengeance is giving 5% more magical damage, which Feral isn't getting. Fire Mage is giving you 5% more intellect, which Feral doesn't benefit from, but Balance does. And as mentioned, the particular niche of Balance is something that Feral doesn't have, which is a very large, wide, consistent AoE damage. This type of damage profile is very good for Mythic Plus overall, even if perhaps in the overall numbers throughout the course of the entire key, balance will or is expected to lag behind specs like both fire and unholy. Those two are generally speaking going to simply be doing more damage than a balanced druid, and it also will get most of the time worse in lower keys. So we're not talking about a 17. You know, if you enter, if you read this, if you watch this and you expect balance to be meta, so you enter your plus 11 with a balanced druid, their damage is bound to be even lower than it is in high keys, because they need packs to stay alive. They need packs to live a decent amount of time for them to actually be doing any kind of AoE damage. So to you, perhaps might look even more confusing while you're entering a key with a meta spec and it's doing thrash damage. Perhaps you're possibly even better off as a balanced druid to still play in Mythic Plus with Keepers of the Grove rather than Eluna's Chosen, simply because you have more upfront burst when you play with Keeper and with your 3 ends over Eluna's Chosen that would have a better result in lower level keys where enemies die just faster. Now, the popularity, by and large, still remains a gigantic chasm between other specs and the pink. I just wanted to point this out, you know, once again. Just look at this. Red Paladin remains by far the most popular of the DPS. In fact, Red Paladin has more players than all of these specs combined. There is more of this than every single one of these at the moment in Mythic Plus. We can display this in a different format, and you can still see the popularity of Red Paladin. You can actually move over to DPS and you can still see the popularity. Yes, of course, once you go into 12 and up, Red Paladin starts losing a bit more, or rather there are other specs that start gaining more ground. You go into 14s and now the popularity of Red has been taken by Unholy and Fire and Balance, and then you move into 15 and it gets even smaller. We are seeing now that more and more players are getting more into pushing high keys, as they don't need that much more attention to the raid, especially that, you know, the good guilds getting towards the end of progress right now. You might start to see more and more, you know, tailored comps to push in Mythic Plus, and you start seeing more and more of this comp starting to arise from good groups, from good, you know, players that usually push very high keys, and you can see them already going on with this comp. So at this very moment, these three seem to be the one chosen for your trio of DPS. There wasn't really any worry about the chosen one for tank. We knew it was gonna be Vengeance. You know, don't get misled by the fact that compared to last week, actually Vengeance has lost numbers in 12 level keys and up, simply because more and more players are getting to plus 12s, meaning more and more tanks that aren't Vengeance are getting to plus 12s. So their number is getting shrunk this week, but that's not because in the high keys is getting shrunk either. It's just now 12s being a lower number in general. It's the same with Discipline. You know, Discipline in 15 and up is still quite popular, and then in 12 it looks like it has shrunk compared to last week over other healers, but not really at the very highest of levels. You can see this growth also in picture form of most popular compositions run. The first one in line is Fire, Balance, and Unholy. And what is different from other weeks is, of course, that now Unholy has popped up way more than last week. Only a couple of Unholies were seen in the most popular comps last week. Now there is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of Unholies in the most run comps. So for now, we can definitely put a seal of approval for the confirmed meta comp for the season, being Discipline, Vengeance, Unholy, Fire, and Balance. It went almost exactly as planned. The plan was Discipline plus Vengeance and triple caster comp, assuming that the 3 casters were there to do magical damage. Instead, we had double caster plus Unholy, but as we have mentioned multiple times, practically all of the damage of Unholy is Shadow, meaning it's magical. So it still scales with at least one part of this combo. It scales with the magical damage taken of Vengeance. It doesn't scale with Intellect, given by Fire Mage. So technically, any other DPS that does scale with Intellect that you bring in is going to be doing 5% more damage compared to what Unholy would be doing, just by buffs in the group. But at the moment, clearly, there doesn't seem to be any other caster spec being chosen over Unholy. It could have been Devastation, perhaps the newly buffed Demonology, maybe Shadow Priest, but for now Unholy has been the spec of choice. It also helps, to be fair, to have a melee. You know, this comp is interesting because it's not particularly crowd control heavy. Balance Druid has an absolutely terrible interrupt. Discipline doesn't even have an interrupt. Discipline has barely any crowd control besides a single fear. Fire Mage also doesn't have exactly that much crowd control to dish out in the group. You would mostly have to be carried by Vengeance and their chains, sigils, their silence sigils, their AoE stun, and by the Balance Druids Vortex for movement control and Typhoon for knockbacks. Those would have been pretty much it as far as crowd control went. Unholy at least brings some single target stuns, some grips, you have some AMS to cheese some mechanics, which is still not that great, but at least you have a melee interrupt as well. What perhaps would have completed this comp much better in terms of crowd control and utility, something that many players have complained all the way down here at the beginning of the season, would have been a shaman, would have been elemental shaman, which can bring multiple things like an AoE stun, the AoE knockup, the single target stun, a melee level interrupt, which is why perhaps it is the more interesting part that Unholy is winning over Elemental. Even from a damage perspective, Elemental is doing pretty good, but for now it seems like Unholy has been chosen as the mega turbo burst AoE spec for Mythic Plus. Maybe now after the single target buffs given to Elemental Shaman, they might be growing a little bit compared to what we've gotten so far. But all in all, this is what we can see in terms of development of the meta in Mythic Plus at the end of this third week, getting into the fourth week, basically the end of the month of the first month of the season in Season 2. Definitely, I would say, compared to what were the expectation, the one surprise would be Unholy. Most of the other choices were more or less expected to become popular over this second season of Mythic Plus. So, for today, on this Friday, we can give up our recap of Mythic Plus at the end of week 3 of the season. So, with this out of the way, we can now say our goodbyes, starting by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys very likely tomorrow, and in the meantime, okay, so now it's cloudy again. It's rained yesterday morning, then it was sun to the point where I was sweating in bed, and now it's cloudy. I love spring.